Moment. Senator Casemeyer and I served on his committee for 11 years. Now, he wasn't chairman the whole 11 years, but we certainly served together. And this year I moved over to finance. But I want to tell you, this gentleman is truly a great man to work with. And the committee does a tremendous amount of work. And I say this jokingly, and I hope it's taken in the. I think every legislator needs to be sentenced to a budget committee, and certainly serve their time and try to figure out exactly what goes on behind the scenes, because there certainly is a dynamic there that I think would bring a fresh perspective to everybody as they try to set policy for the rest of the state. But I mean that because we also had conversations where he says, "I need to talk to you." He said, "Now, here's what I think we're going to do, and you're not going to like it." But I've also gone to him and said, "Well, here's what we're going to do, and I don't think you're going to like it." But we have been able to establish that type of relationship, and he's a class act, and it's an honor to work with you. But some of the issues we're going to talk about, the opening day of session, when I had the opportunity to make my remarks as a minority leader, I stood up and said, "Mr. President, we're going to support you when you're right. We're going to fight you when you're wrong." We get plenty of opportunities there. But more importantly, I think in a new breath of trying to move forward, as we had done with budgets in the past, we're going to try to offer some alternatives. And some people aren't going to like what they see in those alternatives, but as we did with the first, when we presented an alternate budget, the second alternate budget we presented was a preview of coming attractions. Because some of those ideas in the first budget actually were adopted by the governor and the legislature as we moved forward. And the fact of the matter is, I think that a dialogue back and forth and a contested dialogue can be very healthy for us. Sometimes when you get into some of the personal rancor, that's when it's distracting and it's detracting. But I'd like to think that we've stepped it up and we're trying to move forward, because we all stand to gain when the state of Maryland wins. And yet we also have to be cognizant that when we're dealing with people's money, it's OPM. It's other people's money. It's tax money. So I applaud the leadership in getting on board with moving in the estate tax recoupling. In fact, I have a bill in, it's Senate Bill 155, which is doing just that, and it's phasing it up. Last year we had it in as we're going to recouple right away. The fiscal note was very stiff. This year the proposal is to phase it up, because we do want those people that have capital and can choose to stay in Maryland not to have the tax issue as a reason for them to leave Maryland. Because not only is it about where they choose to live, it's also about where they choose to donate. Our nonprofits have been harmed by people with means who have relocated to Florida, Texas, Arizona, other places. And in fact, south of the Potomac River, all states are recoupled. So I applaud the leadership in moving forward with that. The other tax issue that I sent the bill back to drafting because it didn't quite have a cap in it that I wanted to see, but I would like to see, there's been conversations about having a corporate tax cut. And that might be fine and dandy. We have another bill in which is to mirror Virginia's corporate tax rate, so that at least that's taken off the table as a competition. But I acknowledge that there's a large fiscal note with that. But the other bill, the other idea that came out from that, is to allow self-employed or small businesses, whether it be through a K-1, a Schedule C, or whatever that source of income, to be tax-free, at least from Maryland's perspective. And especially as there's a conversation about increasing the minimum wage for some people at the lower rung of the ladder. We can't necessarily guarantee that a business can make a profit, but we can step up to the plate that if they earn a profit, the first portion can be tax-free. And that is within our realm. So that proposal is forthcoming also. The minimum wage, we also had a conference call today where perhaps the earned income tax credit could be used as an alternative way to do that. But we'll have to see. I see that train's coming down. Another thing as minority leader, you learn the difference after a few years between a light at the end of the tunnel and a train coming the other way. So minimum wage is coming down this track. So the idea is, what can we do to try to enhance things and also recognize that there are certain policies that can happen in Annapolis. And one example that we've seen in Western Maryland is the tobacco tax. Yes, there might be social policy behind it, but retailers have been harmed by the increase of that. Retailers across in Virginia are loving it. And yet Maryland consumers are still using it, so the revenue goes elsewhere, but we still have the social cost. And so if you do this, something like that with minimum wage, we have to try to find a way to mitigate it. I'm not supportive of it. But, I don't have the time to go into why I'm not supportive of it. And yet there's a lot of people saying, look, what's the harm? What's the harm? You need to do some good. But in my opinion, there's some practical reasons why we shouldn't be doing that. One thing that we are hearing an awful lot about, and certainly on the Finance Committee we're dealing a lot with, is looking at the health exchanges and what's going on with that debacle. But we have to keep in mind there are two separate issues. One is how we got to where we are, and that certainly is going to take some time to dig through and find that out. And whatever that is, we need to determine what they are and the corrections in place. The second part, which we are moving forward in the Senate with, and I presume the House is as well, is an emergency bill to try to help those people that have been harmed by the malpractice that took place with the inability to get that thing up and running. And I suspect that bill will move forward, and I also want to acknowledge and compliment the private sector, because the private health carriers, 4 of them, have stepped up to say, well, retroactively put things in place. And isn't it ironic? Now, of course, here I am from the private sector and from the insurance industry. But isn't it ironic that the health insurance industry had been denigrated and criticized for causing a lot of the ills that we're faced with, and they are stepping up to the plate to help fix some of what went wrong, or at least to offer a gap. So I want to applaud the private sector for stepping in to help Maryland's families and Maryland's individuals with that. The last thing I want to touch on, as we talk about business in Maryland, let's change the conversation so that we're talking about employers in Maryland. There's plenty of class warfare going on by talking about big business, whether it's Walmart or fill in the blank on the proper name for it. The fact is they are a large employer in Maryland, and a private sector employer, and medium employers, and small employers. And increasingly, as we can recognize that that's what they do by providing a benefit to Maryland's families and individuals, that they can take care of their families, we want them to thrive here. And Maryland, like it or not, has a real problem in perceiving itself as being attractive to the private sector. When you go from 13 Fortune 500 companies to 3, there's an issue. Now that's a symptom, and I'd like to applaud the leadership in acknowledging that we have to do some things to try to ensure that we can support the private sector and the private employment industry in Maryland, and let's make ourselves even better than we are. Thank you very much for the opportunity to do this.